Good morning, bonjour. Je m'appelle Chuck.
My name is Chuck Burchill.
Arctic Paradox panel. We're down one panelist. Mr. Amos is, I think, still preparing his slides. But we have a terrific panel this morning, and I don't want to delay the start. And the bios are all in your program, so I won't go through the biographies of each of our distinguished panelists. To say that we're beginning with Bernie Funston. Bernie Funston's from the North, lived in the North, is now the chair of the Canadian Polar Commission, and he is going to set the framework for what follows. Bernie.
Thanks, Chuck. And good morning, everyone. You're obviously the hardcore. Saturday morning, 9:30, that's pretty impressive. I've told Chuck I'm going to keep it to 15 minutes, and if I don't, he's got a big cane. He's going to come out and pull me off the stage here. I'm going to set a general framework, which really doesn't say very much about environmental law, but hopefully has some context that might prove useful as you go through this career, this business, this intersection of your vocation and the world around you. I will leave most of the heavy sledding on the environmental law side to my colleagues because they're certainly capable of doing that. I've called my talk the Arctic Paradox, and I think the reason for that will come clear in a second. And I've done something I rarely do. I've actually made speaking notes, which I probably won't refer to, but just in case I lose my way on a Saturday morning. I'm going to start with a quote from Brundtland, the Brundtland Report, the World Commission on Environment and Development, Our Common Future, from 1987. Essentially, what I hope my framework will give you is some perspective on how challenging the Arctic is. It's one of those areas that we often think about, and we don't perhaps know too much about it. So hopefully this will give you some thoughts. In the Brundtland Report, you've heard many quotes from it. This one you may not have. It says, "The environment does not exist as a sphere separate from human actions, ambitions, and needs, and attempts to defend it in isolation from human concerns have given the very word environment a connotation of naivety in some political circles. But the environment is where we all live, and development is what we all do in attempting to improve our lot within that abode. The two are inseparable." And Elder White Duck made a reference to our role as caretakers of the planet. And I think we're at a very critical stage of human development, given that there are 7 billion of us on the planet. And one of the fundamental questions that underlies environmental law, of course, is how we manage our ecosystems to support the population that we have. And I tend not to look at the Arctic as a region, and you'll see that very clearly from my slides. The bottom line here is, how do we do this? And it's not about managing the environment. Environmental law doesn't manage the environment. It manages human activities within the environment. And so I'll start with that, and we'll come back to it. Anyone who's read a newspaper, a magazine, watched TV, or listened to the radio in the last 5 or 6 years has probably had a steady diet of Arctic issues. Here's what I call the evolving Arctic storyline. Climate change is causing the Arctic ice to melt. Consequently, there are going to be new shipping routes across the top of the Arctic. The Northwest Passage, the Northern Sea Route, will open up, and perhaps even sooner the over-the-top route across the pole from the Bering Strait to the Fram Strait on the European side. All natural resources in the Arctic are therefore becoming accessible. Nations have competing and conflicting claims to the seabeds. The EU and China and others, India, Korea, Japan, Singapore, are starting to assert Arctic interests. The Arctic has become a potential hotspot for future conflict. If anyone knows Rob Hubert, a good friend of mine, Rob, I call him Rob, the Russians are coming Hubert. Certainly a valid point of view. Polar bears are disappearing. Scientists need more time and money to study what's happening. Traditional ways of life of northern people are disappearing as fast as the sea ice. And the legal and governance regimes in the Arctic are inadequate to deal with the emerging situation. So that's what I call the emerging storyline. And that storyline, for the average person who hasn't been in the Arctic, conjures up these images of dark satanic mills, as I call them. The public perception that there are large oil rigs going down in the Bering Sea and the Beaufort Sea, that the terrestrial lands of the Arctic are pinholed with oil and gas wells. These are, in fact, from the Gulf of Mexico and I think Texas or Louisiana around the turn of the last century. The reality is somewhat different. The Arctic is still relatively pristine, but there is an appetite, there is an interest. There are drilling rigs that are in the Chukchi Sea and in the Bering Sea and in the Beaufort Sea. There is an interest in Arctic energy. There is an interest in Arctic minerals. You may have heard about the Mary River iron ore mine that was going to be an all-round year or all year round production. It's been dropped off to 3 months. One of the things that we sometimes forget when we hear the stories about Arctic development is that development is driven by two things generally, cost and price. The cost to develop, which is very high in the Arctic. There is a huge infrastructure deficit, especially in the Canadian Arctic. And of course, the price of the commodity. So if iron drops in price, Mary River becomes not a year-round operation, it becomes a 3-month operation. So those are two things to keep in mind. But what's missing from the storyline as I've laid it out? To me, the key issue is that many of the fundamental changes that are occurring in the Arctic ecosystems are being driven by external pressures. They're not coming from the people who live in the Arctic. Climate change is driven by fossil fuel consumption and burning across the planet in what I call the populous middle latitudes. Transboundary pollutants that are appearing in the food chain, they're not coming from industrial production in the Arctic. Pressure for shipping routes, this isn't really driven by local communities in the north. Tourism, well, we're not putting 3,000 people on boats to see the Davis Inlet or whatever. These are coming from outside. Fishing pressures as well. I mean, there are local fisheries, but they're not major commercial enterprises. Non-renewable resources as well. Most of these are external pressures. And what that says to an environmental lawyer, I think, is that you're in a complex situation. The Arctic is one of the few places on the planet that we've actually changed significantly without even going there. And the law and the legal regimes, the management of human affairs driven by environmental law is sometimes directed at the Arctic, whereas it should really be directed outside the Arctic. The most significant changes will come not from how you regulate a particular drill rig or a particular mining operation in Iqaluit or off the shores of Iqaluit or in Contoido Lake or one of these places in the north. It'll depend on how you manage the large populous parts of the planet. So in a nutshell, the Arctic today is what I call a tightly coupled component of a highly dynamic global biophysical, geopolitical, and socioeconomic system or systems. That's just a nice way of saying that, and this is probably one of the key takeaways this morning, that you have to think outside the Arctic. Environmental law, as it relates to the Arctic, is as much about the non-Arctic as it is about the region itself. So from there, I'm going to pole vault into a couple of other just quick comments and then look at a little bit more at the practical implications of what's happening in the north itself today. And you'll notice I use the word Arctic in a fairly loose way. Here's a map that shows the Arctic region. I think it's up there. The orange line is the line that is used in the Arctic Human Development Report produced by the Arctic Council. And as you can see, it takes in a lot of what we would consider subarctic, the boreal forests of Canada. My view is that the Arctic Circle, the reference to the Arctic, over the course of our history has tended to ghettoize the Arctic. It's that part above the tree line or up north or at the top of the world that really isn't relevant to anyone else. It's cold, it's dark, it's miserable, no one lives there except the Inuit, and it's not really that important. That has changed critically in the last 5 or 6 years. And my view, the change is vital because it means the Arctic has to be seen in a global context. We have to forget the line of demarcation. We have to stop ghettoizing or regionalizing our thinking about the Arctic for the reasons I've already mentioned. What's driving change is not what's happening in the region, but what's happening outside the region. So I kind of advocate getting rid of the line and stop talking about the Arctic as the Arctic. Start talking about it as an indicator region for the planet as a whole. I used a rather inelegant metaphor when I was in California giving a talk. I think I was probably showing my lack of understanding of American culture, but I referred to the Arctic as a victim in a drive-by shooting. And it really is. We need to look at where the guys in the getaway car are. We all want to flood to the Arctic and do the right thing, help the victim. But in some cases, we would do a much better job if we worked outside the Arctic on these tough issues. So, Arctic perceptions. What's going on in the Arctic today? Where you start often and almost always determines where you end up. You know, if you're starting at the North Pole, everywhere you walk is south. We have to think about the Arctic in different ways. There are a lot of interests at play. There are a lot of values that are being challenged in regards to the Arctic. I use a framework of 4 conceptualizations, which I hope you'll find helpful. To some people, and I'm one of them, the Arctic is a homeland. It's where I was born and raised. I've spent my whole professional life in the Arctic. I've cheated a little bit. These pictures are actually from Greenland. And they were taken in June of 2009 when the local people were celebrating the coming into force of the Greenland Act, the Greenland Governance Act, which moved them one step closer to independence. So there's Kupik Kleist and his cabinet, and we've actually even got some Sami rap dancers going on here. But the Arctic is a home, and we sometimes forget that. We sometimes assume it's a big terra incognita. It's a vacuum at the top of the world. Well, it's not. Never has been, and I hope it never will be. Others see it this way, conception number 2. They see it as a frontier. And for the frontierists, and you know, I don't mean to generalize or be negative. I have to move quickly, so I can't give you all the nuances that are necessary. But they tend to see it in terms of engineering challenges. Can we build an icebreaker strong enough to get through this thickness of ice, to get this amount of war down south at this critical time in order to meet this shipping schedule or whatever? The frontierists constitute a very real pressure, and you're familiar with them in environmental law. Others see it this way. There's a very large international science lobby, and they see it as a laboratory. They think we can't do anything, precautionary approach, let's not move in the Arctic until we understand everything. And we're a long way from understanding everything. We don't understand much about how the Arctic system works within the Earth system, but we're learning more every day. Finally, there's a group that see it this way. They see it simply as a wilderness without people. And there are large groups that have very good intentions. I came across an international organization that wanted to do some spending in the Arctic, and they started with, what can we stop? Is there anything we can stop in the Arctic? We'd like to stop a pipeline or stop a shipping route or stop a mine. And they didn't look at it in terms of the people that lived there. They simply looked at it in terms of the animals that they'd seen on TV. All valid views, all valid and important perspectives. But in order to understand these, in order to move forward on them, we have to find a way of balancing them. And this is the real challenge of law. Law doesn't spring from ideal forms. It's there to protect interests. It's there to regulate people. And these pictures that you see here, these are all reports from the Arctic Council. They deal with the human development. They deal with Arctic shipping, pollutants, oil and gas, women in fisheries, flora and fauna. Large organizations like the Council bring together an interesting mix of people to try to find a balance, but it's not a straightforward process. In closing, and I'm almost at the end, Chuck, I got about 1 minute left, I think. Here's what I would suggest in your approach to environmental law, something that you might want to consider, what I call rethinking the North. The first is you have to look at the homeland perspective. Most of these perspectives that I've mentioned, the four, the frontier, the laboratory, and the wilderness, they tend to be driven by outside values, outside interests, and they often mute or overpower the local voice. What we have to remember about the North in the last 50 years is that there have been significant developments that have brought the people of the North closer to the political and economic engines. Aboriginal people in particular, through their land claims and self-government agreements, are an integral part of the political and economic mainstream in the North. They are decision makers now. They weren't always, well, they were always originally, and then they lost it, and now they've got it back to a large degree. Industry is looking at moving north. They want to do it in a corporately responsible way, and it's to everyone's interest that we find useful ways to do that. The environment is a key factor in decision-making in the north today. Challenges that will emerge, I would predict, will underscore what I call Canada's infrastructure deficit. We're not prepared for what's going to come next. We weren't expecting the ice to melt. We're not very well prepared on the infrastructure side. Some of our operational and security preparedness is quite low in my view. And again, resource development and governance decisions will increasingly involve Northerners and their governments. And I talk about public governments, but also Aboriginal self-governments. As kind of a final thing to keep in mind as you look at environmental law as it applies in the north, I think it's important to keep in mind that some of what I call the meta-narratives can overwhelm local voices. People in communities want to get on with their lives. They want to raise their children. They want to do well. They want to keep their water and their land safe. And it's sometimes overpowering to be talking about sovereignty and security and governance and climate change and some of these large global narratives. But they are a very important part of what's going on in the north today. This, I've already said, is part of the Arctic paradox that I set up at the front end. One is that environmentally responsible regulation of activities in the Arctic is only one dimension, and perhaps not the most important dimension, of meeting the challenge of saving the north or preserving the environment in the north. Because of these external pressures, we have to look over our shoulder all the time. And of course, the real challenge for us as humanity is coming to grips with the 7 billion people that live on the planet and finding a way that they can all move forward. We tend to use economic growth as a measure of our success. Economic growth, of course, is consumption, and it feeds three masters: an increase in population, an improvement in individual standards, and then, of course, the catch-up of the poor and the less advantaged. And those are very tough masters to serve when you have a finite carrying capacity in an ecosystem. So with that, I will say adieu.
We're just going to hold questions till the end, but the nice question for Bernie will be, can you really have a balancing of those interests, or whether there should be a hierarchy. Our next speaker is Don McCrae. For those of you at the university here, you'll know him well. Trade law, environmental law, law of the sea, and also Arctic law as well. So we're going to hear from Don about Arctic regimes. Thank you.
Musical chairs here. I don't find my slides.
Living in fear that it's living in fear that the stick has my ego turned on. Tara, people react to that.
Just, yes.
Was it not working? It was fine. Was it good?
Great, thank you very much. Sorry for that delay in starting. Thank you very much to the organisers of the conference for inviting me to be here. I feel a bit of an interloper in an environmental law conference, but what I have to say is provide some sort of background for some of the environmental law issues. What I was going to do was to look at the international legal regime. You can see my slides are normally to international lawyers, therefore I'd never thought of putting international in front of it. But what I would do is provide a bit of a framework for some of the discussion that's going to follow on, and particularly perhaps for David van der Zwag. And as Bernie mentioned, the Arctic is often portrayed as an area of interstate conflict. A couple of months ago, I got a call from a Russian radio station asking if I could give an interview on the coming war over Arctic resources. I think they must have thought they were phoning Rob Hubert, actually, and they got his number, but they actually got my number, and I expect they were quite disappointed in what they heard. There is a legal regime, an international legal regime in the Arctic, one that has its origin in the practice of states and is embodied in the Law of the Sea Treaty, that is, in respect to the Arctic Ocean. And states seem to be following it. Well, what is the international legal regime? And if you look at the Arctic, you see it's an ocean surrounded by states. The states are sovereign over their land territory, so they have jurisdiction, control over their land territory. And the regime of the oceans is essentially the same regime as applies to any other oceans in the world. So there's a territorial sea for each state. There's an exclusive economic zone. There's a continental shelf that extends out from their coasts. And there's a high seas area in the center. In other words, the Arctic is no different from an international legal point of view, or the Arctic Ocean is no different than the east or west coast of Canada. But of course, there's something wrong with that analogy, because the Arctic Ocean is really not like any other ocean. Historically covered by ice, navigation was difficult, if not impossible, and its history is littered with attempts to turn the Arctic Ocean into a passage for navigation. That, of course, was the history of the Northwest Passage. And when you look at a map of the Arctic like this, you see that thinking as if it were like the Pacific or the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean is also misleading, because it's essentially surrounded by states, no more like the Mediterranean Sea than like the Atlantic Ocean. Well, were these factors, the question of the fact it's surrounded by states and covered by ice, were they really taken into account when the Law of the Sea Treaty, which provides the international legal framework today, was adopted or was negotiated? And I think the answer is largely no. In many respects, the Arctic was forgotten, ignored, and it wasn't central to the negotiations that took place in the 1970s for the Law of the Sea Treaty. No one would contemplate that global warming would occur. No one would contemplate that we'd start to think differently about the Arctic, as we're now starting to do today. And so the regime, the international legal regime that relates to the waters, the Arctic Ocean, is to some extent applicable not because of the particular nature of the Arctic. It's not the particular circumstances of the Arctic that have created the legal regime. It's simply because it's treated as an ocean. So the legal regime for the Arctic Ocean essentially exists by default. But now, it's not exactly true that no one was thinking about the Arctic at the time of the negotiations of the Law of the Sea Treaty. Canada was. And our concern was over the possibility of oil-carrying icebreakers generated in part by the 1969 voyage of the SS Manhattan. And this meant that we wanted to control the waters of the Northwest Passage. That, of course, led to the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act. And what Canada wanted to do in the Law of the Sea negotiations was to get international acceptance of the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act. And, of course, Canada was successful in doing that. Article 234 of the Law of the Sea Treaty gives the coastal state the right to regulate shipping in waters of its 200 nautical mile EEZ, waters that are ice-covered most of the year and pose exceptional hazards to navigation and threaten to harm the ecological balance. So the inclusion of Article 234 was a great achievement of Canadian negotiating. But it was a deal struck largely between Canada, the USSR, which had similar interests to Canada in respect to the Arctic, and the United States, because other countries really were not interested. The Arctic was not seen at that time as a likely place for shipping in any event. And if you look at Article 234, it's predicated on the assumption that the Arctic would not change, the assumption that it would remain ice-covered and difficult to navigate. So with the melting of the ice, the things that Bernie has been talking about, the prospects for shipping are now real. The prospects for hydrocarbon exploration and exploitation are starting to emerge. And we find ourselves with a legal regime that was there because we never thought that either of these things would really ever happen. And this has led, I think, some to suggest that there's a need for a new legal regime in the Arctic, forgetting, in fact, there is one already in place, albeit, as I said, somewhat by default. But what is in place is a jurisdictional regime, not a management regime. And this is something that David Van der Zwerg will talk about. So let me then, in the time that I have, talk about some of the contours of this jurisdictional regime and what are the issues that are currently confronted by states in the Arctic from an international legal point of view. And if we talk about navigation issues, they are largely, in Canada, dominated by our claim that the waters of the Northwest Passage are internal waters, that we have a right to control navigation because they're Canadian waters, control it completely, independently of whether Article 234 exists or not. And of course, while this raises passions in Canada, all about Arctic sovereignty, frankly, few outside are really concerned about it, except as a matter of principle. And that, I would say, includes even the United States. The United States, if Canada suddenly makes a public announcement about the Northwest Passage, will of course respond and say we disagree. But in practice, Canada applies its laws to the Northwest Passage as if it were Canadian, and in practice, no one objects on a day-to-day basis. Russia more aggressively manages navigation in the Northern Sea Route. And again, there's differences of view between countries in Russia as a matter of principle, but in practice, no one is out there on a day-to-day basis objecting to what Russia is doing. And of course, potentially, if we put aside our particular preoccupation with the Northwest Passage, potentially what is much more important may be shipping in the Arctic Ocean itself that does not, in fact, go through the Northwest Passage. And that, of course, is a matter of much more international concern. That is a matter which there is some negotiation on a polar code to try and provide international rules for that. If we move beyond the shipping issue, the navigation issue, then there are exclusive economic zones which effectively encompass a large part of the Arctic Ocean. And the slide here, the white parts are 200-mile economic zones of the various countries surrounding the Arctic. And those zones, as you can see, leave a central core as potentially high seas and international seabed. But if you then go beyond this and say, well, what about the continental shelf? Well, of course, under the Law of the Sea Treaty, states can extend their continental shelf out fully to the continental margin, beyond 200 nautical miles. And of course, the big question is, where is that limit? And states need scientific evidence to show what the limit is. There's a complicated definition in Article 76 of the Law of the Sea Treaty that I won't bore you with. But what states have to do is to determine the science and then go to a United Nations body, the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, and ask that body to review the science and see whether they agree with it it's technically accurate. And this is what Canada and the Arctic states have been doing. Canada makes its submission to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf at the end of this year. And that raises one of the more difficult questions, and that is the question of ridges on the seabed. And of course, the big dispute that has gone on for a number of years, whether it's a dispute or whether it's simply a question, is whether the Lomonosov Ridge is actually continental in nature or whether it is a deep oceanic ridge. If it's continental in nature, it's part of the continental shelf of Russia and the other end of Canada and Greenland, and therefore can be part of the continental shelves. And that's a difficult question. The evidence that it seems to be emerging, I would say some years ago, people took the view fairly universally, except in Russia, that it probably was oceanic. The view that seems to be emerging now is that it's more likely continental shelf, and that therefore both ends, the countries will be able to claim their sovereign rights over it. And the effect then, if you look at the way in which the continental shelf will be defined, or the extended continental shelf will be defined, it's quite possible that the effect is that the states surrounding the Arctic will be able to claim most of the seabed as part of their continental shelf. And if you look there, the pink, or whatever color you want to say that is, area is a potential area of state jurisdiction, and the little bits left in dark are the potential areas left for the international seabed. In other words, most of the Arctic Ocean will be subject to the jurisdiction of the coastal states, be the continental shelves of the coastal states. And of course, that means, and when you think about that, you realize that if they'd been thinking back in the Law of the Sea days of negotiations about what a semi-enclosed sea is, they might well have thought about the Arctic. They might well have defined a semi-enclosed sea in a way that included the Arctic, which arguably it doesn't include the Arctic. But they weren't thinking about that at that time. And of course, what this means is that if, in fact, most of this area is going to be covered by continental shelves of the various states, then there are going to have to be boundaries between states. And I'll just give you an example of a couple of ways of doing it. If you draw sector lines from the coasts of each state, that's what the area would look like if you divide it up. The North Pole is somewhere around I don't know, very good. It's somewhere off the Lomonosov Ridge, which runs down here. So the North Pole is somewhere in here, and I think under it's probably around here somewhere. That's if you use sector lines, the lines. If, in fact, you then use, instead of sector lines, you use what are referred to as median lines or equidistance lines, you see that the area that each state gets is somewhat different. Russia gets a lot regardless, but the United States and Canada, you can see, vary quite significantly. That's the issue that's going to have to happen in the future if, in fact, all of the states are able to show that scientifically the continental shelf is within the seabed is part of the continental shelf and within their jurisdiction. Just to conclude, in fact, apart from those potential boundary disputes, there really are not many disputes going on in the Arctic at the moment, contrary to popular view. That is, disputes between states. There is, of course, our difference with the United States, probably the major boundary dispute since the Russians and the Norwegians have settled the Barents Sea. The major boundary dispute is with the United States in the Beaufort Sea. That's something that has to be resolved at some point in time. The irony of the positions of Canada and the United States is the position of Canada is that the boundary continues the 141st meridian. The position of the United States is an equidistance line. That goes out to 200 nautical miles. If you go beyond into that area I was showing you before of seabed, suddenly the Canadian line is much better for the United States, and they get much more if they use a line going like that, and Canada gets much more if it uses the United States line. One of the ironies in the negotiating positions that perhaps they hadn't thought about. And the other dispute, because there's obviously a major dispute of great diplomatic consequence, it's over Hans Island, and that's certainly an island between Greenland and Canada, which has that. It looks like that. It is that. And clearly worth going to war over that piece of territory. So, just to finally conclude, what this shows, I think, is that the law of the sea regime provides a jurisdictional framework. We can say who has what, who claims what, but there's no real management framework. That's been built up episodically, incrementally, tentatively. The broad legal requirements in this area is for states to cooperate. But apart from that, the Law of the Sea Treaty doesn't say much more. And that raises a fundamental question about environmental management in the Arctic in the future. I think a fundamental political question. Given that most of the area can be divided up into national jurisdiction, how should it be managed? Should it be managed by individual states simply looking after their area? Should it be managed by the Arctic coastal states all getting together and working out what is a kind of a semi-enclosed sea and accommodating their own interests in there? Or is it an area that belongs to the world? Notwithstanding all my arguments about jurisdiction, there are many outside of the Arctic region who regard the Arctic in a different way from the way in which the Arctic coastal states. And if they had been thinking about it back then, might well have had a different view in the Law of the Sea Treaty about how the Arctic is to be treated. And on that basis, I will bring it to an end. Thank you.
So our next speaker is David Vandersweg. He holds the Canada Research Chair Tier 1 in Ocean Law and Governance at Dalhousie University. But save for your moderator, they're all Tier 1. here this morning. David's going to address the subject of governance and the Central Arctic Ocean.
Thanks, Charles. I see the camera person's becoming a bit lazy up there, so I'm going to move out in front to make sure the camera has to move. I'm going to pick up for where Don left off in terms of a really neglected issue, and it's this huge area in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, often called the donut hole. It does exist. It's over 2.8 million square kilometers. It's not a small area. And largely neglected by, I think, most of the coastal states up to now. At least, as Don said, there's a couple deep seabed areas beyond national jurisdiction once we get these things delimited. And two images, I think, help capture where we are in the governance today. One is cooperative currents, and Don's got into that a bit already. We have global agreements like the Law of the Sea relevant, and then there are regional eddies, which I'll just mention very briefly, and then a restless sea, very unsettled law and policy future with four kind of churning water realities that I want to just quickly flag in less than 13 and a half minutes. This is electricized. I guess if I go over time, it'll become, I'll get electrocuted. So Giles has arranged this. I will stop very quickly. And it's going to be a speed cruise. I think I will set an Ontario, at least a University of Ottawa record for the fastest PowerPoint. So don't blink, because I will skip over a few slides. The global streams, we have the Law of the Sea, and I'm not going to go over all the details, but the key thing in here is like China, South Korea, they do have rights to go up there, freedom of fishing, freedom of shipping, and that's a concern. And then you have flag state jurisdiction, which prevails the prime principle for controlling activities. And there are obligations to conserve fish stocks up there. There's an obligation to undertake environmental impact assessments for planned activities if they have substantial effects on the marine environment. So there is a cooperative framework under the Law of the Sea Convention. I call that the mainstream. And then you also, though, have various multilateral environmental agreements. And again, we could be an hour lecture here on all the environmental agreements that apply, but just to flag a few, you have the famous POPs Convention from 2001, the Stockholm Convention. We now have 22 chemicals listed for elimination or restriction. And again, having some good effects. We do see the decline on DDT, PCBs, a number of them going down in wildlife, and that's affecting also the Central Arctic Ocean, and of course also in the humans and the Inuit mothers in the Arctic. Some good news. Again, some bad news. We have around 4,300 other chemicals that are up there that may accumulate, so we don't have a total grip on this, but there are some good news stories. And then, of course, we now have this new convention coming on that will be concluded later this year, dealing with mercury. And over 60% of the mercury that ends up in the Arctic comes from outside China, India, etc. So that's a big concern. And then finally, the kind of third stream are the IMO, International Maritime Conventions. And you have the MARPOL Convention that deals with prevention of pollution from ships, has 6 annexes, deals with all the sources of pollution from ships. And then we even have guidelines for ships operating in polar waters from 2009. They apply to the Arctic, but also the Antarctic. And again, they're very weak, I would say, on environment. They only have a couple pages, a chapter in there, chapter 16. It's mainly dealing with damage control, saying, have some equipment with you if you have an accident up there, because you're very remote. And then it just calls for application, essentially, of all the conventions that are already in existence, which really aren't very effective for polar waters. And then it says also why you should always follow industry best practice, whatever that means. So it's a very, I would say, minimal regime that's been set up. And then we have the regional eddies. I'm not going to go into all the regional eddies, but you have the Arctic Council that was mentioned already. And then under the Arctic Council, they actually negotiated a few years back the Search and Rescue Agreement. You see the map there. We now know who has primary responsibility to respond if an aircraft or there's a major maritime disaster. They divide up the Arctic, and you see the maritime zones. And then right now, ongoing is negotiation of a further regional agreement, which will be a treaty, regional agreement on oil spill emergency preparedness. Again, that's likely to apply to the Central Arctic Ocean. And again, countries are supposed to monitor if there are spills up there. And again, we might see some kind of joint response under this agreement that's hopefully will be concluded in May of this year. Restless Sea. Here we go on the second image I want to pick up on. It's very hard to get a grip on where governance is going to go for the Central Arctic Ocean. And for unsettled, restless kind of realities. One of the surging suggestions is for strengthening Central Arctic Ocean governance arrangements from NGOs, from academics, and others. And I just give you a few of these suggestions: adopting an Arctic Ocean Framework Convention applicable to the Arctic marine environment, both within and beyond national jurisdictions. Again, the 5 coastal states have said, not now, not in the near term. They don't like that idea very clearly from the Ilulissat Declaration in 2008. It's been suggested by a well-known Canadian academic that we could have a regional sui generis approach. The 5 coastal states would just divide the pie and exclude the rest of the world. I don't think that's going to be reality, and the coastal states aren't going to go in that direction, and certainly China, South Korea, Japan would not sit idly by. So I wouldn't hold your breath on that one. But what is more possible, a regional fisheries management organization for the region, the U.S. Congress has called for that in a resolution a number of years ago. It's been, we can expand the fisheries jurisdiction, Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission. We could create a regional ocean management organization. We don't have any one of those around the world, but it may be a first up there. And then you can always designate a marine protected area, either the high seas or the seabed. Interesting question: could the coastal states eventually decide that they maybe want to put off limits for future mineral development in areas beyond national jurisdiction? Again, a very political kind of question that looms on the horizon. The second reality in terms of rest of the sea is just the shifting governance seascape for Arctic shipping. In 2009 already, we had negotiations within the IMO beginning on this question. Should we have a binding polar code? How do we get there? And you're going to see ship traffic likely increase over the pole. You see the 2013 record set, actually September 2012 record set of the retreat of the ice. And we do have a polar code already that's voluntary. It's going to clearly cover the Central Arctic Ocean. It already covers the Arctic Ocean. And some aspects of the code, certainly you're going to have a couple parts to it, some mandatory, some recommendatory. There's going to be an environmental chapter. And right now, where we are is a lot of uncertainty about, and a lot of political infighting. How strict should the environmental standards be under the code? And I can't get into all of it because of time, but for example, what training standards should be applied to ice navigators up there? And more importantly, should heavy fuel oil be prohibited in the Arctic as it is for the Antarctic? And what should be the environmental discharge standards, emission standards, for example? If you look at North America, we already have a North American emission control area for areas of the economic zones off the Pacific and Atlantic coast. Could they be extended up where you have really required for low sulfur fuels to be carried? What about black carbon from ships? Should that be controlled? And if you look at the Antarctic, we have a zero discharge for the Antarctic for oil, for noxious liquid substances, for garbage, with the exception of food waste. So should the same thing apply to the Arctic? This is all being debated within the IMO as we speak. And then finally, what about sewage? Terribly weak standards under the IMO. MARPOL Convention allows raw sewage to be discharged at a distance of more than 12 nautical miles from the nearest land. Not exactly a strong standard. Does not cover gray water from showers, laundries, and galleys. And then you see the statistics where these cruise ships can generate up to 3 million liters of wastewater each week. So again, with more cruise ships going up, a huge issue. And then very quickly, because of time, I do have a timekeeper here, but continuing debates within the UN regarding the future governance of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. There's been a debate going on for almost a decade, and it hasn't gone away, and it hasn't been settled. And basically, one of these is the UN Open-Ended Informal Consultative Process on Oceans and Law of the Sea. They meet every June in New York, and they've not been able to resolve what should be the future regime up there. And they've met a few times on this. And then, more importantly, there's this ABNJ, Area Beyond National Jurisdiction Working Group. They've met 5 times, last time in May, and they haven't been able to resolve. And what are the issues? 2 big issues, bones of contention. One is, what about marine genetic resources, which can be billions of dollars worth of resources up there when you take enzymes out of even the high seas off the Arctic? Is it a high seas freedom? That's been the position of the United States of America. We will go up, we will take them. We don't owe anyone, not developing countries. It's all ours, freedom of the seas. And of course, the other view of many developing states is the right of common heritage of mankind. It's the term they use in the convention, but it's actually humankind. But it should be a shared access, a benefit sharing arrangement. We need new regulatory framework on that. And again, this has not been resolved. The second major contention point, should there be a new treaty, international implementation agreement to the existing Law of the Sea Convention, to address this question of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. The European Union has been pushing that, and basically what that might do is establish MPAs, high seas, a framework for doing that, enhancement of environmental impact assessment provisions, clarification of governance principles like precautionary approach. Why this is important, if you eventually get a global new agreement on the high seas biodiversity, then you can be assured that the Arctic may be first in line for a global listing on that. I would suspect a lot of NGOs would be pushing that. So again, you have to keep an eye on that. We are making progress. There will be a 6th working group meeting in August, and they're going to try to decide by the end of 2014 whether there should be an implementation agreement or not. So there is some progress in terms of further discussions. And then very finally, because I only have 1.5 minutes, the Arctic Council's PAIM working group has been undertaking an Arctic Ocean Review project with 2 phases. Phase 1 has provided a descriptive overview of all the global and regional agreements that apply to the Arctic. They published that in May 2011. And Phase 2 is going to suggest options for strengthening global and regional agreements and measures for the management of the Arctic marine environment, with a final report coming out this May at the Ministerial Council. Now, there's a chapter on living marine resources, and it's very likely, and I would say certainly, going to raise this question, should there be precautionary moratorium on development of commercial fisheries in the central Arctic Ocean? The U.S. has already done that in their Beaufort Sea, Chukchi Sea area. In 2009, they put a precautionary moratorium in, no commercial fisheries until we have more science. And the chapter in this review is going to raise some options. You can have a UN Sustainable Fisheries Resolution. It could be an Arctic Council resolution calling for a moratorium. There could be a multilateral agreement. And it remains to be seen, because this document will be negotiated in terms of recommendations. And will the 8 Arctic states come up to some kind of consensus? Should there be a moratorium or not? Stay tuned. And Bernie, I think, is one of the co-leads on that. And I don't think those recommendations have been finalized yet, to my knowledge. And right on time, congratulations. But I think the bottom line, I would say, is that when we look at the governance of the Arctic, and certainly the central Arctic Ocean, it's an unfinished voyage, a really unfinished voyage. And I would just, if I had another hour to go on in chemicals management, I really think we're missing the chemicals boat. We really have not a grip on the chemicals in the Arctic. Most governments think they do, they don't, and I'll stop there.
While the technical apparatus is being hooked up here, brief introduction of Will Amos, our 4th panelist, Executive Director at Ecojustice. For those of you, again from U of O, it's no stranger to the folks here. Will's going to take us back from the international view and take us to a more domestic perspective on offshore drilling. Will.
Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, this really is a privilege to speak with such a distinguished panel. I feel like I am the real junior here. And I'd like to thank CHAOS for creating such a great event. This is a really interesting conference, and it's a credit to the U of O students and to those who they're collaborating with across the country, establishing this new organization. It's a really great thing. So, congratulations. So, I'm going to try, as Chuck said, bring this a bit back to a domestic level. And examine some of the legal and political dimensions of offshore development in the Arctic. And I am mindful of what Bernie was suggesting before, that this, we have to conceive of the Arctic in ways that we have to be respectful of the fact that the Arctic is someone's homeland, as well as being something that we Southerners view as being part of our domestic jurisdiction. That's a complicated discussion to have. And I think you'll find in some of what I'm reflecting on, ideas that Bernie has proposed. Just by way of context, offshore drilling is happening already in the Arctic. On the Alaska side, Shell started drilling top holes in the Chukchi Sea this summer. They've invested $4.5 billion in their exploratory leases. It's serious business. They're moving ahead. On the Greenland side, on the sort of west side of Greenland in the Davis Strait. Cairns Energy drilling exploratory wells in 2011. These are very controversial, and it's, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody, and you're probably, many of you are probably aware of the international campaign being waged, largely by Greenpeace, but there are other organizations involved, really, really pushing hard against drilling. So the meta-discourse that Bernie was referring to earlier, the meta-discourse that we're hearing around offshore oil is yes, no, yes, no. And so I think that's something that's going to play out, but it's obviously a more complex question. Now I should have, I was remiss because I promised a future presenter from the next panel, Lara Tesaro, my colleague, that I would introduce Ecojustice, and if I don't do that really quickly now, then I'm just going to end up taking time out of her presentation that she wasn't anticipating. So just so that you guys have a bit of context as to where I'm coming from, I'm a public interest environmental lawyer. I'm based here at the University of Ottawa, and Ecojustice, which is Canada's leading public interest environmental law organization, set up a partnership with the Faculty of Law here so that we could teach environmental law students what it is to practice public interest environmental law, and so that they could help us on files. And files that I'm working on include Arctic offshore drilling and Arctic shipping. So there is a real connection here. And that's where I'm coming at this from. So drilling's happening, but it hasn't happened recently in Canada. And the anticipation, though, is that it will, or proposals will come forward. BP has invested over $1 billion in exploratory licenses. That gives them the rights to seek approval to drill. Imperial Oil has invested over $500 million. If they don't drill exploratory wells within a 9-year period, they forfeit 25% of that investment. So there is pressure, and that is something very real, and that debate is going to be heard loud and clear in this country in the coming 2 years. I think it goes without saying that there are significant risks associated with Arctic offshore drilling. I'm not going to get into those in any specific detail. I'm happy to take questions on those. But what I will do is I will, and this is again a nod to what Bernie was saying, I'm going to quote what Nellie Cournoyer, the chair and the CEO of the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, effectively the most powerful person in the Canadian Western Arctic. Here's what she had to say. She says, the Inuvialuit need a level of comfort that we do not currently have in the 3 main areas of environmental risk associated with hydrocarbon activities in the Beaufort Sea. And these are the prevention of a blowout, the timely stoppage of a blowout, and the containment and cleanup of hydrocarbons from a blowout. So risk is the frame that we're talking about here. And it should come as no surprise that this risk frame has been heavily influenced by events outside of the Arctic. So again, I return to Bernie's theme. The media frenzy that accompanied BP's Macondo blowout was something that I'd never experienced, and it actually really impacted my career. At a personal level, I now have what I consider to be a public interest environmental law offshore drilling practice. I do 50% of my work is probably focused in some way, shape, or form on offshore drilling, and that's really due to this BP event. But one can't discount the fact that this epic disaster occurred in front of the world's flat screens. It was live streamed across the web. People were watching the oil spew out on their computers. So there was obviously an immediate impact domestically in the U.S. There was a U.S. presidential commission into the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. There were a series of other reviews. And this was taking place in the U.S. You know, the U.S. saw this as a domestic issue, but very quickly in Canada, people recognized that this was going to change the way offshore business was being done. And quite frankly, the civil society in general, and environmental NGOs were not focused on offshore drilling in the slightest pre-BP. There were literally no organizations with any campaigns. And so this has really changed. This has changed what this has changed the nature of the discussion, and I think that it's important to understand that Canada was going to, the Canadian government and other governments in Canada, in particular Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, governments where there are offshore interests, they were going to have to react. And so what happened? Well, the National Energy Board decided that it would initiate an Arctic offshore drilling review. And this was determined about a month after the Deepwater Horizon incident occurred. So it was actually still, the oil was still spewing into the Gulf of Mexico when this decision was made. But it's really interesting to know what could have been done, and I think that's a subject that can be explored a bit later on if we like. There could have been a public inquiry. There could have been a joint Canada-Newfoundland Offshore Petroleum Board, Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board, and NEB review. There wasn't. The only review that really occurred, there was a sort of a pro forma review done by the Canada-Newfoundland Offshore Petroleum Board that really didn't take the issue particularly seriously. But the NEB did go ahead, and so what did they do? They went about a year and a half process gathering views on offshore drilling, and with a view to collecting all the best technical information around Arctic offshore drilling, with a view to collecting all of the views of Northerners around offshore drilling. It was sort of a combination of consultation process with an exploration of whether or not the legal regime and the legal regime was adequate, combined with input of technical and scientific information. It was a bit of a grab bag, but also a very important process. Now, why? Not because there was any formal decision that came out of it that was going to have an impact on yes or no to drilling in the Arctic, but because for the first time, Canadians from across the country, and in particular Northerners from all over, well over 100 participants flown in from the smallest of communities, brought in to share their perspectives. And there was obviously an output. There was a report that was issued in December of 2011. There was a separate document called Filing Requirements Document that accompanied this report. And to an important extent, this clarified what is the National Energy Board going to be expecting of offshore operators when they present proposals to get authorization to drill. So this is actually really helpful in a sense that it clarifies for civil society what are the parameters of a future project proposal, and I think it made it very clear to everybody the divisions in and the tensions in northern communities around the prospect of offshore drilling. So I won't go into this any further, but I mean, if you look at the very back of this image here, you'll see a bank of glassed-in boxes. Each of those represents one translation booth. That's how many different languages were being engaged. You can just get a sense of how diverse the community was at this Arctic offshore drilling review. So what were the key findings? Here they are for you. One of the key findings that is not here in bullet form that I'd like to go into briefly, and very briefly since time is running out, is the issue of the same season relief well requirement, or SSRW. The most fascinating aspect of this whole process was that prior to the NEB review being announced, and prior to the Macondo blowout, Imperial Oil had asked the NEB to lift its same-season relief well requirement. Now, what's the point of a same-season relief well? Well, as everybody knows from the BP incident, the point is to drill another well so that you can intersect the well that is blowing out, fire cement down it, and plug it so that the blowout will stop. Now, Imperial Oil said, and this is again prior to the BP spill, we don't need to have any regulatory requirement for a same-season relief well. We have demonstrated over many years that offshore drilling is safe. It's a 1 in 285,000 well occurrence. So all of the other measures that we take, including these fancy new blowout preventers we've invented that everyone's using successfully in the Gulf of Mexico, well, these are working. Don't worry about same-season relief well, please. And they desperately need this relief well requirement to be lifted, because if they want to drill in the Arctic, in deeper waters in the Arctic, in around 1,000 meters, it takes them over a year to drill the well. So they're not in a position to satisfy any requirement to drill a relief well in the same season if they can't drill the exploratory well in a season alone. So they're desperate to get this relief well requirement lifted. But then BP happened. And most interestingly for us, they had already provided all of the evidence that they thought was necessary, as they'd already submitted the evidence to the NEB, to justify their case. So we actually had a perfect situation so that we could walk in and say, well, here's the evidence they're proposing to suggest they don't need an SSRW requirement. We don't agree. And so in the context of representing World Wildlife Fund Canada, Ecojustice was present at that event, and now moving forward, we have an NEB report that does not lift the SSRW requirement, but allows for equivalency. And this is going to be the big debate in the next year or two. Imperial has released a preliminary information package. They have every intention, it would seem, to move forward with a project proposal. And the question will be, can they provide an equivalent to a same-season relief well, some other form of technology that satisfies? So that's going to be the big question. And I guess I should have flipped over to that slide. I'd just like to conclude by pointing to some of the what nexts. Arctic offshore drilling is a massive topic at the domestic level, so there's so many different themes. As I mentioned, there's this joint proposal. Just for your information, recent budget changes mean that there is no federal environmental assessment required for exploratory drilling. This spring, you should be anticipating federal legislation that changes offshore oil spill liability rules. This has been quite publicly discussed in the press by cabinet ministers. And another dynamic that no one really seems to be talking a lot about is the devolution negotiations between the territories, between Nunavut, between Northwest Territories and the federal government. If a devolution agreement is signed, it will kick into effect a process to negotiate devolution of offshore governance. So that has massive repercussions potentially as well. And so these are some of the big legal and political discussions that are happening around Arctic offshore, and I appreciate the opportunity to go a little over. So thank you.
So I think the mics are all set. Questions for the panel? No questions? David.
I'll speak up, so hopefully I can't find mic. Just on the equivalency issue that Will raised, what, if any, is the procedure that might be in play for the NEB to determine the so-called equivalency? Is it going to be any kind of public procedure? Is it going to be just written submission? Do you know?
The answer isn't clear at this point in time because Imperial could go in a couple different directions, and I'm presuming that they will be the focus of this discussion. They could propose a project, and the SSRW requirement could be discussed as a portion, as a debate within the contingency plan approval process. And the contingency plan is something that is evaluated pursuant to an environmental assessment. I mentioned that there's no federal EA, but there would be an EA under the Inuvialuit final agreement. So there would be an environmental assessment process first through the Environmental Impact Screening Committee and then likely over to the Environmental Impact Review Board pursuant to the IFA. So it could be considered as a component of the contingency plan pursuant to an EA. However, it is also possible that Imperial could turn around and do the exact same thing that they did prior to the BP blowout, and they could simply say to the NEB, the key issue for us is going to be same-season relief well requirement. We want to know what's equivalent, whether what we've got is the technology we've got is equivalent. could we have a separate hearing on this specifically so that we don't waste everybody's time with a huge process? Because one can imagine that even an EIRB environmental assessment process will be, over the whole project, would be very, very, very complex and would involve a lot of evidence and a lot of cost to a lot of people. So they could go specific to that issue and bring that issue back to the NEB, just as they did before the blowout, or they could bring it in the context of a project proposal.
Other questions? Rod.
Just going to the question then of the whole commons debate that three speakers are talking about. Canada is moving with a conservative government to assert the Arctic question more prominently in every part of its agenda. Is the agenda better served by a commons in the Arctic or a privatization of the Arctic, or whatever you want to call it, among the various nations there? Where do you think we're best served?
It's likely to be a combination in terms of the extended continental shelf would be my take on it, where you have rights to minerals. And again, I suspect the coastal states, once they get the delimitation worked out, will want to know what's out there. I think we still have a lot of uncertainty. But I think in terms of the commons, there's no question there's going to have to be some cooperation down the road. It's just a matter of how quickly it has to come. You know, the melting ice is not going to probably happen tomorrow, and I say that lightly because some scientists now say it could be 2015. The best estimates may be 30, 40 years where you lose the ice for part of the summer over the high Arctic. I've heard some of the recent scientists from Norway who are leading the field in fisheries science, they really don't think the fish are going to migrate up very quickly, maybe 10, 15, 20 years. So, what's the urgency? On the other hand, that's why maybe precaution makes a lot of sense. It doesn't mean you set up a lot of, like RFMO. It may not, who's going to spend the money on an RFMO if it has nothing to do? But it may have something to do in terms of the scientific cooperation. I think that's the big issue I would see. And then maybe a precaution moratorium to make sure that we have some time to get the science together. So it may be an evolution.
Sorry, Ben.
Go ahead.
Just to add to that, I doubt that any of the Arctic coastal states are going to relinquish any jurisdiction over the continental shelf. So they will draw boundaries, and then they'll operate within their continental shelf, maybe exchange information, collaborate with each other. Where the commons possibility exists is with the water column, the Arctic Ocean itself, and that's where none of the states can claim anything in the water beyond 200 miles. So that is the area where, as David said, every state has an interest. It potentially can come in, it can fish, it can navigate, and that's the area of commons that has to be worked out. But I can't see it happening for the seabed. And then the part of the seabed that is so limited that's going to be International Seabed Authority, there's not going to be much there for it. And to think of a new treaty which will amend the Law of the Sea Treaty, that's, I think, a highly unlikely proposition, at least in the foreseeable future. But then that's what we thought about the Arctic some years ago, too.
I'll just add one grace note. This illustrates fairly well my sort of underlying point in my presentation, that sometimes our attention can be distracted by the esoteric and the novel, the mysterious, the new. The Central Arctic Ocean really is a deep ocean with probably very few fish at this point. Arctic cod are 1 to 7 inches long. There are not that many of them. They're a keystone for the ecosystem, very important. But while we're focusing on management of what is likely a marginal area for development anytime soon, we have these larger questions of climate change. And if we get, for example, permafrost melt, which is a terrestrial, not a marine issue, or even the methane hydrates on the ocean floor starting to percolate methane, we've got a game changer for humanity. And so we can worry about how many ships take Arctic cod, or we can look at some of these larger issues. And we can't do one or the other. I think Will made a very good point. We can't focus just on the international. But there are some big issues out there that we can forget about if we get too focused on the esoteric. And I don't mean that the Arctic Ocean is an esoteric area, but we can spend a lot of time talking about its management while things are going to hell in a handbasket on shore. So the scientists that I hear and talk to are very concerned about the methane release and the permafrost issue. That is a game changer.
Last question, any questions? Please join me in thanking this panel.